everyone. Good evening, everyone in the Tribune, on the Tribune, and good evening, everyone at home watching from via our YouTube channel. It's a pleasure for me to introduce these BK Talks today. It's actually the last one before the summer comes, so in a way, it's really nice to close today the academic year of the BK Talks with Is This True? Democracy, Autocracy, and Truth Forming, and what architectures got to do with it. To me, it's a complex title. This is actually the result of a collaboration with the Inclusion and Diversity Group at the Faculty of Architecture, which is led by Diversity Officer Roberto Rocco. Today, we have also Caroline Newton being the moderator. And I want to thank Nuram, Ivo, Andrei, Filippo, and Nesha to be tonight with us. They will introduce themselves properly, comme il faut. So I will just go into to my note about the day. It was, for me, very difficult to say something meaningful because these people know a lot more than I do about this subject. So I prefer to go somehow into something a little bit more some kind of autobiographical note to say what for me truth has or not has been. I was born during the dictatorship of Francisco Franco. By the way, I don't know why we're always talking about autocracy now and not dictatorship, but maybe you could please answer that. For me, I was born in a dictatorship, and for me, that guy was always a dictator, not an autocrat, but please let me know what the difference is, and please let the audiences know what this is. So this was the truth when I was born. I was born in a fascist regime that this is Francisco Franco making his tomb. He decided that he needed to make a tomb as let's say, an homage of those that died during the Civil War, but it was actually his tomb, his glory that was actually going to be perpetuated in the mountain in the outskirts of Madrid. I was born in West Madrid, and I could see this tomb from my window, from my parents' window, every morning. So this is something that has impacted me enormously about truth. But the thing is that a lot of people died in order to build that glorious monument to his glory, not to everybody else's glory. In any case, he died. These are images of his burial ceremony in that mountain, and this is where the place under the mountain where he has been located for over 40 years. Because the fascist regime ended in 1975, but his tomb could always or still be visited. He made everything secure. He secured everything, his continuation. So he decided that Juan Carlos I, King of Spain, would become the King of Spain and perpetuate the monarchy in Spain. The kingdom would go on. And we must actually, to be truth, in 1931, the people of Spain have actually decided that they didn't want kings in the country. They preferred a republic. And that was the result of a democratic election that led to civil war, that led to dictatorship. And this dictatorship decided that Juan Carlos would be the next in governing. So this is him. This is Juan Carlos I of Spain, who was the chief of state in a parliamentary democracy for about 40 years. This is his family. When I was a child, I had his portrait on top of my head every day, or on top of the teacher's head at the school, and they were true. These people were the truth. And you could actually not say anything, let's say, offensive about this family. We were in the middle of a parliamentary democracy that was born and was being solidified throughout the years, but still it was a crime, and it is still a crime to say something offensive about the house of the king. And I wonder, should we maybe put that into question? In any case, during those 40 years, this place, this is Franco's tomb, became a monument. The body was still buried there. And during 40 years, in this amazing landscape outside my city, which is Madrid, you could go and visit Franco's tomb. That, let's say, prior truth. These are images of the space. The space is amazing from, I would say, from architectural point of view. But for me, this image is key. For 40 years, over 40 years, people, fascist friends and fans, could go on a daily visit on a daily basis to visit this monument. They thought that still Franco's truth was the real truth and that Franco should come back. And there was no law or, let's say, no regulation against activities like this one, which in this case means that you're showing a anti-constitutional flag. You could carry it around, and that was actually not a problem. You could go to this monument and claim that you are a fascist by throwing your hand like that during 40 years. So, and one started wondering, I come from a Republican background, and of course my family always opposed activities like this, but during the Spanish democracy, a dictatorship could be worshipped. So I want to just let you understand how difficult for me was to, in a way, to understand certain truth. For 40 years, fascists could go worship the dictator in his tomb. And in those 40 years, a certain, let's say, development happened. For 40 years, Spain became, I don't know if it was the 7th most powerful country in the world, et cetera, blah, 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 blah. And the country developed enormously, and I want to take you now to urbanism and design, because at the end of the day, this is the Faculty of Architecture. So what happens during those 40 years is that the country started an amazing period of development that translated in transforming the territory, the cities, et cetera, based on a regime that authorized the worship of dictatorship. I just want to give that, let's say, framework in order to say that the fabrication of the city is a political act. And this is the result of political decisions. The problem is that when crisis happens and things don't go as you think, failure happens. I've spent many years of my life circulating around or trying to understand all these failed pieces of territories, all these failed urbanisms that are the result of a society, I would say, that would worship dictatorships in times of democracy. Something was actually wrong. We are talking about corruption, we are talking about all modes of things that in many cases are unlawful, I would say. So these are just landscapes left out of that kind of society that was created until 2014 comes, and it's impossible to have the king still ruling because he was being, let's say, associated to, you name it, any kind of dictatorship in the Persian Gulf or other sorts of, let's say, corrupting activities. You know? He abdicated, and then he appointed his son, Felipe VI, who started being the next king of Spain, again in a parliamentary democracy, since 2014. This is the new royal family that we all worship now, or some worship actually a little bit less. And in this context, finally this picture is happening. This is, I think, 2 years ago. And think that was 2 years ago, 2020, the dictator is actually taken out from his tomb. We have waited over 40 years to the dictator in a democracy to leave the place that he built by killing people. So there's a new era, maybe beginning. I just don't know that, and I would like the panel to keep talking about it. But I'm just going to finish by this, because my investigation of places that have failed and the political reasons that made those places fail, et cetera, took me to Equatorial Guinea. This is one of the first visits that Juan Carlos made, is Equatorial Guinea, and that's the dictator, which is still ruling Equatorial Guinea, Teodoro Obiang. Teodoro Obiang, who lives in Malabo, decided at a point that he was not safe in Malabo, and that he needed to build a new capital that really represented the dictatorship of Guinea Equatorial. So he started building the Gibloblo, and I went to visit this place in the middle of the rainforest. So I'm trying to make, again, an association between political power, dictatorship, and the fabrication of a city and the transformation of the territory. This is images of my visit to Gibloblo. In order to get there, you need to build a 200-kilometer-long highway through the rainforest, which will never be the same any longer. And then construction starts, et cetera. But what you find there when you go there is that actually the places that Teodoro Obiang would think would be the places where he would be worshipped, this avenue here was meant to have military parades, are not working anymore, are failed places because all the investments failed or fell in the cracks of corruption. And this is the result that you have, which is a territory that has completely transformed. This is a city. This is what we architects and urbanists plan and design. So I want to make everybody aware that at the end of the day, in order to make these places that have been decided by dictators or kings or presidents, etc., need a designer. And this is a question for students. Are we complicit? Do you feel complicit or not? I think those are questions that probably will be answered today. At the end of the day, what you have is this kind of urban waste. Only one hotel is now working, and this one hotel is only visited by a few members of the Chinese government visiting Equatorial Guinea. And I leave it there, and I leave the word now to our panelists. First of all, Roberto Rocco, Chief Officer of Diversity and Inclusion at the faculty, will give you a talk, and then we will go into the panel itself. So please welcome very much all our panelists tonight.
Good afternoon or good evening, everyone. Thank you so very much for being here today. I think, oh yes, I have to talk. So for those who know me, you know I never use notes, but today I'm going to read a little bit just to keep to my time. I was also born in a dictatorship. I'm not going to tell you the year. But I was also taught during my childhood. I was born in Brazil, right? And I was also taught during my childhood a certain version of the truth, right? I was told that indigenous people were stupid, that they needed to be taken care of. I was told that the role of Brazil in the world was to provide the United States with soya and so on. And as I grew up, I kind of discovered that those truths were not exactly true. This is the slide that I show students when they come to Balcundo for the first time. Their first day here, I give a presentation and I talk about diversity. And this is what I show them. And I want to say, well, diversity is colorful, it's nice. We love to be different, and we love our different identities that we have, right? But, and within our diversity group, there is a diversity group in this faculty. There is an idea that we need to talk about our ways of being, our identities. And I think we are kind of forgetting that there is a political dimension to diversity. For Doreen Massey, she says that if time is the dimension of sequence, then urban space is the dimension of contemporaneous existence. In that sense, urban space is the dimension that poses the political question, how are we going to live together? It's in the city that we need to decide how we are going to live together. And we can't decide how we are going to live together if we don't agree on a few things. We can't live in parallel realities to talk about how we are going to live together. For this man, this is John Rawls, a philosopher of justice, a liberal philosopher of justice. He says that truth concerns validation, and justice determines acceptability. So I need both to the formation of a public sphere where diversity can flourish. So we need truth to validate stuff, and we need justice to make things acceptable, right? And in this democratic sphere that is built by this, diversity can flourish. We cannot have diversity in a place, in a dictatorship, right? And I completely agree with you, we should use the word dictatorship. Amartya Sen, this amazing Indian philosopher and Nobel Prize winner, he says that we need democracy by discussion, where truth and justice through public reasoning will give us some agreements that we can take to go forward. We don't have to agree on everything. There is no universal truth, but through public reasoning, we arrive at certain small truths, coalitions of truth that can take us forward. This was taken forward by a lot of people in planning, and among them, Patsy Healy on the photo. That she says that this public reasoning that Amartya Sen was talking about must accept the contributions of all members of a political community and recognize the range of ways they have of knowing, valuing, and giving meaning. So we do have different ways of understanding reality, but we must hear from a lot of people to be able to form some kind of truth. It is true that we see reality in different ways, right? This guy, this is Habermas, he says, well, and maybe people think that he is a little bit naive by saying that, but the power of the better argument confronts and transforms the power of the state and capital. So within that public reasoning, he says, well, the power of the truth will challenge power. And I think that's very, very powerful. Truth, justice, and democracy are at the center of diversity. If we don't have one of the three, we don't have diversity. This is a demonstration in Hong Kong. And what to do, I ask, and I don't have an answer, what to do when public reasoning and public truth are eroded, when truth is manipulated, when there are alternative facts and people believe in different stuff going on and nobody knows what the truth is. Actually, somebody knows what the truth is, right? There is some kind of truth that we can look at. And how can we agree on how we are going to face all these challenges that we have as a human race, as people living in one planet, if we don't agree that climate change exists, that COVID is a real thing, that there is systemic racism, that there is civic oppression? How can we agree to face these things if we don't believe they exist? So everything is a hoax nowadays, and everything is a lie. And I'm kind of seeing this sip to the students, because my students are becoming very cynical of the truth. Truth doesn't exist. We know there are no absolute truths. We need coalitions of shared truth that allow us to act, I think. And, oops. My question is, can architecture, planning, and design remain neutral? Can we say there is no truth and hands off, right? So my invitation to you, our distinguished panel, and to you people at home and also here, is to discuss this and tell us what you think. Is it possible to have some kind of truth or not? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Roberto. And welcome to everyone here in the Orange Hall and at home. My name is Caroline Newton, and I will try to moderate the discussion tonight. And let's see how that goes, and how many opinions and ideas and thoughts of truths we can discuss. So I'll just very briefly explain how we are going to try to do that. And I will first ask the panelists to just very briefly introduce who they are and emphasize their link and their interest to the topic. And from there, we're going to go into more detail. We have asked everyone to bring an image, and that will be the starting point for all the panelists to make a point, make a sort of a statement around our question for tonight, and from there we'll have the discussion. And before we end the session, we will open the stage for you to ask questions. So please feel really free to pose any questions, give any comments, because in the end, it's what Roberto said, it should be a discussion between all of us here in Bouwkunde. So first, I would like to ask Nuran to briefly introduce yourself.
Good evening. I'm Nurhan Aboujidi. I am a Palestinian architect, urbanist, and most importantly, activist. I am currently a professor and a chair of a research center at Zoid University of Applied Sciences called Smart Urban Redesign. But I have an ambition and passion to investigate, to understand architecture and urbanism beyond the normative, the philosophical and the conceptual. I want really to go to understand it as a resilient, as also an enabler for emancipation, to empower people, to be also the voice of the voiceless in these processes, which is actually brilliantly presented by you and by Javier, thank you. Because these are our realities every day as architects and urbanists. What can we do about them? And for me, I am working for 20 years in diverse contexts, obviously in Palestine, in colonial context, but I also want to work on other extreme urban conditions from Syria, Iraq, refugee camps, and in Europe, my interest was working also on vulnerable neighborhoods with immigrant-based, they call them problematic neighborhoods, from Brussels, Molenbeek, to Zaragoza, Spain, and now I'm very busy in 5 cities in South Limburg. I will take you into my ambition, my interest in this actually topic later with my image. Thank you.
Thank you, Nuran. Andre?
Very much. My name is Andre Radman. I'm one of the 3 members of the Architecture, Philosophy and Theory group here at TU Delft. Used to be an architect in my first life, and I'm a theorist. So by way of my opening line, would you allow for just a very brief, I'm going to attempt something that is almost impossible. It will inevitably be a caricature, but I want to give you 3 possible takes on truth, if I may. So the first one is the pre-Enlightenment moment, truth as God. So, you know, nothing to be, it's about ultimate eternal essence and something that produces an appearance. So the essence is, as I said, immutable, not to be challenged, it's necessary, and all the contingent, corrupt moments of appearance. It has been replaced by Enlightenment idea, where we have not essence versus appearance, the disjunctive couple, it's either essence or appearance. We have something very different. We have the conditions of possibility of something that then appears. And that's really different because now we slip imperceptibly from the idea of creation, metaphysics, to something that could be closer to foundation, epistemology. So we have as I said, the conditions of apparition and the apparition itself. And then the third, I was building up to the third moment, and I think we might be living through that moment. It's the truth of the event, something that displaces both the disjunctive couple of essence versus appearance, necessary and contingent, the conjunctive couple of conditions of possibility and something that appears, with something that I would like to refer to as the process ontology, that connects the actual state of affairs with something that exceeds it, namely the virtual, which is full of potential, not necessarily manifest, but nevertheless fully real. And this, of course, is stepping out of the long tradition of that takes a priori as necessary for something to emerge, because anything that we arrange, including architecture, produces an incorporeal effect, which in turn determines how is it that things can unfold in terms of their individuation. So it's a non-representational, there's no resemblance between the actual and the virtual, and it shows, and we arrive at the point where, you know, it could be mistaken for relativism, and it has been in terms of postmodern relativism, that anything goes and there is no truth, as Javier, I think, and Roberto have already alluded to. But I would like to claim that this is not the relativity of truth. It's the truth of the relative, of the relational. And I will be making case for that. And this is also my subtle, or perhaps not so subtle, critique of the basic premise of the idea of the fact that in order for us to act, we have to agree on something a priori in advance. I would like to turn things around and say, perhaps there is another way of going about it. That is to say, if architecture could contribute to action before we actually are settled on what in this kind of messianic mode of projecting a goal to be achieved through action. That action comes first, the relation comes first, and has the capacity to engender its own relata, subjects and objects, collectivities, and so on. This is what I will be trying to make case for.
Okay, thank you very much, Andre. Aisha.
Thank you, Caroline. It's been a pleasure to be here. I work with the Environmental Science Department at Wageningen University. And because there is a promotional material in which there is an introduction included, I need to make a correction that last year, consciously, I decided to step out of tenure track and chose the teacher's track. So that is something I'd like to mention here. My background is in science and technology studies. Much of my early work is on looking at the relationship between technology and development in India by doing anthropology and history of technology. But more recently, I have moved on to do more philosophy of science. I published a book in 2018, which is a kind of alternative history of genetic science. It's the affective history of genetic science. It's the subtitle of the book. And in this book, actually, I have looked at the way in which scientists' subjectivity relate to their objective science. So what I'm looking into is how science is emotional and how irrationality shape the forms of rationality. That is something that is my more recent work. I think I'm here because I was invited to bring some philosophical thoughts on the question of truth, and Andre actually gave a wonderful introduction, so he gave a lot to think about here. But when my turn comes, actually, I would also like to reflect upon the history of philosophy of truth, particularly why is that in our time we no longer talk about truth. I would actually invite the audience to let me know any book they might have read currently on truth, because instead of truth, actually, we talk about data, empirical material, we talk about objectivity, rationality, reason, mathematics, logic. So truth is always very fraught, and we talk more recently, actually, given the kind of political developments happening all over the world with the rising form of right-wing populism, the debate on what is called post-truth actually has become more prominent. So I would like to share some thoughts on what is truth, the philosophical, historical context of how we understand truth, and then bring it to the question of post-truth when my turn comes.
Okay, thank you very much, Asha. Filippo.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Filippo Santoni De Sio. I am an associate professor at the faculty TBM in ethics and philosophy of technology. So I've studied philosophy all the way back in my life. And then I moved to Delft to do philosophy within a technical university, which has been a great challenge. But I like that very much because I've always thought that traditional philosophy has always been too far away, too remote from the concrete world. And so it's been a great challenge for me to try and connect philosophical concepts to the practices of design and engineering and whatnot. And more in particular, I'm interested in AI and robotics. And so I'm more interested in the digital space than the physical space. And in my research, I'm trying to understand what kind of philosophical concepts, old and new, we need to make sense of our human values in the digital space and in a space where we are sharing our life with non-human systems, artificial systems. And I'm also a teacher, very important. I will say something more about that later on. So I'm not an expert on truth at all, but I am interested in freedom and democracy. And so I think that the big question we need to address is what kind of conception of freedom and democracy we still have to live by in present-day world, also given the technical changes that we have witnessed in the past years. Looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Filippo. And Ivo, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hello, I'm Ivo van der Poel. I'm a professor in ethics and technology actually at the same department as Filippo, at Faculty of Technology, Policy and Management. I have a quite diverse background. I was partly trained as a mechanical engineer. I did a PhD in science and technology studies, and then I moved to the philosophy of technology and teaching ethics here at Delft University of Technology for quite a while. My interest is mainly, or I'm interested in many things, but one of the things I will also be talking a little bit about is the relation between values and technology, how values get shaped in technology. there is this famous saying from Churchill who said, first we shape our buildings and then our buildings shape us. And I think this is very informative if we talk about values. We put our values in all kinds of technologies, also in the built environment. But in turn, this built environment also shapes us and also determines our values and our thinking. And I think this is an interesting way. I will be saying a little bit more about that. I thought a little bit about truth. I found it a really difficult concept. It is a bit something you cannot live with, but also not live without, I think. Maybe one way why this is so is the famous liar paradox. I don't know if you know the liar paradox, but if I'm saying, well, I'm a liar, well, what does that mean? That means that I'm not a liar. Yeah? You understand? So this is called and I think what's interesting about this paradox is that somehow we cannot do without the notion of truth, even if we maybe never can capture truth. And I think this kind of commitment that truth matters, I think that's important, without necessarily claiming that we can know the truth. So that's for starters.
Okay, thank you very much. I think it already gave us a very good first starting point, really the different propositions, but also your point about we cannot do without the truth or some kind of understanding of what it is or what the truths are. So I think that's a nice moment to come back to you, Esha, and discuss the first image that you brought.
So it's a very stark image, actually, and you're going to get really beautiful images when my other colleagues are going to talk, so don't worry about it. But I need to tell you a story before I tell you what this image is. And the story actually is written by the well-known philosopher, writer, Jorge Luis Borges. He's one of my favorite philosophers. Borges actually wrote this beautiful story called The Immortals. And Borges actually asked a very philosophically profound question in writing this story. He asked us what happens if human beings become immortal. Now, Borges actually, if any one of you have followed his work, writes in a fictitious time. He actually is very difficult to put him into different categories. Some people call his work as science fiction. I would not, because he would like to recognize his work more as a speculative fiction, a fiction where he is asking what if question, a more fundamentally philosophical, normative question. It could happen anytime, in a parallel universe, somewhere in the past, in the future, doesn't matter. This story actually, in which Borges actually takes us through a journey with a Roman soldier who goes in search of the people of immortality. He finds them. And when he finds them, he realizes that these people, this is the tribe of troglodytes. They live in a cavern-like places. They don't have language, they don't have culture, art, science. They live like semi-animals. And they hardly actually have any of the faculties that the human beings have developed over centuries. What happens is that when our Roman soldier then lives with these people of immortality, he realizes that these people actually try to build a city of the immortals. And he goes to explore what is this city of the immortals could be. And Borges actually takes us through a very beautiful description of this city of immortals. And this image actually that is here, this is an image of a prison, which is the design of a design of a prison made by Italian artist Giovanni Piranesi. This was done in 1750, and Borges was very impressed by this series of sketches that Piranesi has done. And he actually based his description about the city of immortality based on this particular one of the images. Now, what Borges tells us is it's a city of immortals, because you are the students of architecture, so that's why I decided to choose this image. This is the city of the immortals, which terrifies, repels our Roman soldier, actually, because here the architecture has no purpose. The corridors, actually, they go nowhere. There are unreachably high windows, grandly dramatic doors that open in empty shafts. There are incredibly upside-down staircases. And then Borges says that this is a city is so horrific that its existence, the mere fact of its being endured, even in the middle of a secret desert, pollutes the past and future and somehow compromises the stars. Now, the point actually is that what Borges says is also being told by other philosophers such as Zygmunt Bauman, Heidegger, that the fundamental human need to produce knowledge and the culture and science and art is to find the permanence. Because we all are aware, there is a conscious awareness of the human being that our life on this earth is limited, that it is going to end on one day. And somehow, this is the most fundamental existential need of human beings to live longer than what our biological bodies allow us to do that. And hence, this is the fundamental question that Borges asks us. If we become immortal, we would lose our language, art, science, and the cities, actually, particularly, which are the expression of this massive endurance of the culture that we have built. The point here I want to raise here is that this existential side of producing knowledge and truth, actually. Now, knowledge and truth are two separate things. Andre gave a very beautiful introduction to that, and I will say something about it, how they are different. However, in this moment, I want to conflate them to say that the existential need for creating culture, cities, built environment being part of it is often not much understood topic. Why is that the political, autocrats and dictators that both actually Javier and Roberto talked about want to create a certain history of their own nation, actually, which they are building, is not sufficiently understood and related with the question of justice and democracy. And I'd like to put that point on this agenda here, that along with the question of why justice and inclusion and creating a political system is important, why it must be also understood in relation to humanity's requirement for creating this permanent, enduring, long-term life.
Thank you very much, Esha. I already feel the start of really questioning us as architects and the architecture profession and the artifacts we produce. So it's already a good start. It's very promising. Let's move to you, Filippo.
All right. So I'm not an architect. I've not studied truth, really, so you may wonder what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about something autobiographical. When I was a child, this is a theater in my hometown, Torino, Italy. This is the Teatro Carignano, a very nice opera theater, where also just prose is staged, etc. When I was a child, well, I wanted to be a football player, but that's a different story. But I wrote a book on the philosophy of football because I like to think about the things I like. But then I wanted to perform. I played guitar, I wanted to sing, I wanted to perform. And then I really didn't manage to make a living out of it. I still do some music and stuff, but really didn't manage to make a living out of it. So I turned to philosophy because if I really need to have a proper job, I want to be a philosopher. And so I managed to become a researcher in philosophy. And then I realized that when I was teaching, I could not avoid performing. I was taking teaching as a form of performance. And that turned out to be quite effective because I couldn't get a proper job in a university in Italy, so I was teaching in high school, which was an even better job, if you ask me. Because you're teaching to young people on whom you can really make an impact, etc., etc. Problem is that young people in their adolescence are usually not very interested in philosophy. That's my experience. Maybe I was unlucky. And so I did need to perform to engage them, to motivate them, to convince them that it was worth taking some time to study philosophy and to reflect on philosophy. Then eventually I moved to the Netherlands, to Delft, and I thought, okay, finally I will have a proper, well, proper as a researcher, you know, because as a teacher, as I said, school teaching is the best. But as a researcher, university teaching is allegedly more challenging and interesting and stimulating. So I come to Delft and it's like, okay, cool, now I can teach philosophy. And then I realized that all the students were students in engineering. And so, you know, I was, you know, from the rock to a hard place because they were even less interested and motivated in studying philosophy. So I had to recur again to my performing and rhetoric capacities and skills to engage them, to use my body in the space, to talk to them, to get closer to them, to convince them, etc., etc. And whenever I would tell these stories to my wife and friends, they would be laughing like, okay, yeah, this is sort of it's a cute thing you're doing, but you know, it's not a serious thing, right? So teaching is not that. Teaching is about transferring knowledge. So professors are supposed to be not that. I was always puzzled because I thought I was doing a good job. Then thankfully I met this lady in Italy, this professor of aesthetics in Milan, Chiara Cappelletto, who wrote this book where she precisely claimed that what I was doing was the right way of teaching. And I was like amazed. I wanted to hug her, which I did, by the way. And she said, you know, and she's an expert in performance, in the aesthetics of performance and rhetoric. And she was making the point that this is the way to teach humanities in a democratic country. And that's my point. What's the connection between democracy, knowledge, and performing and rhetoric? And I don't know, honestly, because I'm starting investigating this thing. It's a recent discovery I've made, so I'm sharing with you this discovery. I've not studied it, so I'm just sharing with you my first thoughts based on the book of Chiara that I've read. And so here's the idea that in the past, we had this idea of truth and knowledge as something that is out there and we can just transmit. And as professors, you know, the idea was truth goes to the authors with a capital A, and then from the authors, it goes to the professors, and then from the professors, it goes to the students. So we are just channels for the truth to get to you, which is nowadays we believe is wrong, and it's not the case. So truth is something we find out together, we discover together. But how can we discover truth in teaching when we are diverse, which we always are? And so this colleague of mine said, rhetoric is an understudied discipline. It was so important in the ancient democracies, which were far from perfect, and we wouldn't consider them democracies these days, Athens and whatnot. But rhetoric was so important because the idea is precisely, and I want to engage with this idea of the shared common space, that you need rhetoric precisely when you don't have a common space. Because if you already have a common space, there's no point in convincing you, right? We already share stuff. Problem is, what if we don't share stuff? Then we need to understand each other. I need to come closer to you. That's the importance of the performance, the physical space. I need to use my body, not only my mind or my knowledge. I need to entertain you, to emotion you. That's the only way in which I can establish a contact and recognize that you are diverse. And you may not be interested in what I have to say. That's why I have to make this effort to interest you, to convince you. And so rhetoric is the first part, and the performance is the second part. And here comes the theater. What is that we are doing when we go to the theater, coming to truth? The paradox is that you may believe that the performance is the opposite of the truth, because it's fiction, right? When you go to theater, you know that you're not going there for truth. You're going to listen to a story. But again, storytelling is such an important component of truth. The autobiography, and that's why I'm telling you my story, which I always do with students. I always start by saying, hey, here I am, that's my name, that's where I come from. That's why I'm excited about philosophy. And that's why I'm trying to convince you that even if you're studying engineering or architecture, you should be excited. I want to show you my excitement. I want to bring my excitement to you through my body, through my voice, etc. And so again, there's a nice passage in this book by Chiara Cappelletto where she says, the lecture room is the place where even the shyest of the professor, even the most respectful of the interpreter, at some point has to utter the word I. You cannot hide Students want to know from you what you think. You cannot hide behind the books. And again, I'm struggling with this idea that there is some truth to the idea that this performance, this relationship that we establish with students who are maybe against you ideologically or because they come from a different background, they are not interested in your story, but this sort of, again, I like the idea of this temporary allegiance that we share because we are sharing this room and we have to be there together. That's always what I say to students. We have to spend 12 hours together. Let's try to have fun somehow. Let's try to find a way to have a good time. And so in this negotiation, very situated, in which we need to know who we are if we want to talk to each other, and we need to recognize that we are diverse, there is some grain of truth, possibly, of some possibility of creating knowledge. And there is possibly a key to creating and educating citizens, and not only to give them some knowledge, to show them the value of this kind of very particular relationship that you can establish by trying to persuading the others and to use any possible channels to engage in a meaningful relationship with them. So that is what I wanted to share with you, this provoking idea that in the performance, in the autobiography, in the individual excitement that you can have in teaching, there could be something more than just some fun thing or some interesting knowledge, but there could be somehow the possibility of establishing at a very local, minimal level, something that resembles a democratic space. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Filippo. And it's interesting that we start from this theater. We're also in this kind of setting. These are spaces specifically designed for this sort of interactions. But I would also really like to ask you to think about the stage outside, our city, our public space. How are those spaces designed, and do they offer this opportunity to be a stage, not only for those that are able to speak, but also for those that maybe are not able to speak or that are often ignored? And that do we have public spaces that are able to be turned around? And I have to think about the example that Faranak Miraftab often gives in South Africa, where the motorway suddenly becomes the square, the public square of the city where you go to protest. No, this time it's the street. So something to come back to probably later. But now, Ivo, I want to go to you, and I'm curious to see the image that you brought.
Yeah. So here is my image. And you might be noting that it is again an Italian image. It is the Portico di San Luca, and I will say a little bit more about it in a minute. And maybe the reason I chose an Italian image was very idiosyncratic. I was in Pisa when I got this question, and I was walking around, and I was actually walking through something like this walkway. Well, as you might be aware, there's many reasons, at least for me, to be jealous of Italians. I mean, they have nice weather, they have good food, they have beautiful cities. But they also have many people in public spaces. And this connects actually to the point that you brought up, that we need these public spaces. And this picture for me, well, mainly symbolizes a number of I would even call it values, that I think a public space should meet in order to be conducive to truth-seeking, democracy, or these kind of things. So first thing, what I like about this is this. Well, it is a public space. There is a walkway. It's interesting, if you get out of your house, you're immediately in the public space where you can walk. And I think it is important to go the walkway. You can also drive here. But I think finding truth is slow. It is taking the small paths. And it is taking a path that is open to everyone. But there's also a path here that is sheltered. There's a roof. And it protects us against sun and rain. But I think in a more symbolic way, having sheltered places is important, because if we want to seek truth, we should be able to be vulnerable. We should be able to make mistakes. So I think we need also, in that sense, protected spaces if we together want to look for truth. What I also like about it is, like I said, this is a place where you have to walk. And I'm a philosopher, And one of the ways that thinkers are being symbolized, we all immediately think of the thinker of Rodin, I think. But Rodin, the thinker of Rodin is sitting. And that suggests that thinking is about going inside and being on your place. But there's also another picture of thinking deep, which actually was already, you found already with the Greek, who had the symbol of the Stoa. The Stoa, where these temples, where they walked when they were philosophizing. And I like that idea that philosophizing or thinking is about walking, is about moving. It's not about sitting still. And this also being with other people. So for me, this also symbolizes this walking is about moving. And then, first thing, so this is a walkway. It is 4 kilometers long. And if you walk it all the way, you come to a chapel. And what symbolizes this for me is the idea that if we committed to truth and democracy, it requires an effort. It doesn't come effortless. We have to walk, in this case, you have to walk up the hill. And up the hill there is the chapel. I don't want to suggest that the truth is in religion. Just let me be clear about that. But I think what is nice about it is that it requires effort and it requires commitment. It requires commitment to something common, which I also try to say with this thing about the paradox of the liar. We need a kind of common commitment in order to achieve things together. And I think that is also what is nice about this picture. So for me, this basically suggests, and I can't resist, like a philosopher, to talk in terms of 4 values. The value of being open and inclusive, the value of being needing protection, ability to make mistakes, the values about not inward contemplation, but also active thinking together with others, and the value of shared commitments that requires an effort. And I think it is interesting. I'm not an architect, so I don't claim I can judge built environments on this. But I think it is also interesting to be aware that increasingly the built environment is also a digital environment nowadays. And it's interesting to think to what extent our digital environments that are part of smart cities meet these 4 values. Well, I'd let you think for yourself, but I have my doubts whether all our digital environment meet those values. And that in itself raises kind of interesting questions.
Okay, thank you very much. I think you raised some interesting points, and linking it to the virtual, I sort of share your concern. There are things that you cannot do in a virtual environment that you sometimes are forced to do in the physical. And for me, it has to do a bit with what you said about this commitment, but also this opportunity to appropriate when you walk, when you sort of use the city, that is then also by different voices, by different groups of people, and then the shared commitment to be open to this diverse group of people that claim these spaces. So this is definitely something I think we want to come back to. And now that we have seen some wonderful images, mostly inspired by the south of Europe, I think, Nuran, you're going to take us somewhere different with your image.
Yeah, it's a very provocative image. I think you see this every day while you are seated, in the comfort of your sofa in your living room. Every day these images pass by. But I wonder if you question what happens in these places far away from you. What is the impact of the destruction of people's identity, people's homes and shelters, as you mentioned? And yeah, now it is becoming more near home now here, actually in Europe, after the Ukrainian crisis. And now I think many people start to feel what does it mean to feel, to live in a war zone. I grew up in Palestine in a very nice city called Nablus, dating back to the Roman times, vernacular architecture, and we Palestinians are very much connected and attached to our built environment and architecture as part of the Palestinian cause, the Palestinian discourse, collective identity, and memory, and most important, narrative. the alternative narrative about truth. Who is telling the truth, as Roberto mentioned? You only see part of that truth during to the manipulation of course, media around us. My frustration, of course, seeing my beloved cities and towns and architecture and preferred places destroyed by the colonial apparatus that is systematically destroying the Palestinian spaces of living. And my frustration grew even bigger when I went to School of Architecture in Palestine. And they started teaching me about democracy, about the role of public space, of promoting democracy, social inclusion, and so on. So we as, political and social animals, this is actually the philosophy behind the Greek agora, that is actually the space for the common, where you are allowed to practice your animal dimension, political and social, and negotiate your differences and reconciliate these differences. It's a very nice and nostalgic, actually, now image about what is democracy is about. And this was exactly the essence of the growth of our citizens' civilizations. You are civilized, or can be called a polis, because only when you have that public space, when you have that diversity in public space, the possibility to be diverse and to negotiate. And this is where we can see how public space and the common is a very important essence of our existence through history till now. In the 20th century, with all these digital tools, many actually academics started to question if the role of public space is still important. But of course, during the Arab Spring, Podemos in Madrid, in Spain, Occupy in the United States, we could see that the public space is still the essence of our civilization and is a human need, actually. It is part of our existence. Yeah, what is interesting about that, now, do we still have that public space after the taking over of our big brother and all these digital tools post September 11th? Actually, this is a very big question also for European and Western cities. We notice that in all these narratives, we try to always demonstrate and display our cities and civilizations with this glory, image, and achievements and advancement. But we are, at the same time, forgetting that there is a narrative, a parallel narrative that is going hand in hand with that advancement. I really quote now Libus Woods, who reflected on the Bosnian War, where he concluded by the say, architecture is war and war is architecture. Architecture is a political practice. This is something that nobody can deny. Every line you draw means something and will have impacts. So this is also a point that we come back to. So having said that we see that since the creation of the first cities 10,000 years ago in Jericho, the advancements of cities is going hand in hand with the advancements of weapons and arms technology. This is really a very interesting also part of my research to understand how architecture is used as a tool for domination, oppression, disposition in all the humankind history. From the colonial practices in what we call now Global South, from the iron grid that the Spanish created in Latin American cities, and all these new infrastructure, palaces, name it, it's all an expression and display of power. Power of the elitist white man coming to bring civilization to the Global South. Architecture is also used and abused by the fascist, non-democratic, and I think Javier displays it very nicely by the Franco tomb, but it is also displayed all over Europe from the Nazi's time and so forth. In other contexts, like a colonial context in Palestine, and also the war zones that we don't see here, we don't experience in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, name it, architecture is also used as a tool for oppression. And here I can take diverse examples how in a systematic way the colonial apparatus in occupied Palestine is used, either building a new architecture as an expression of power like the apartheid wall, where you can see a very extreme actually expression of segregation, of all these old anti-values that you just mentioned. And we are in the 21st century, just to remind you. And of course, by the actual destruction of the buildings themselves, the systematic destruction of houses, the building of all this infrastructure from highways, checkpoints, and so forth, just to exclude the other and celebrate one identity, which is anti-democratic and anti all the values that we believe in as architects, urbanists, and of course, humans. So this is the message I wanted to bring here today. And I want to say, like, the sad reality behind this, that all the masterminds behind all these tools are our, if we can call them colleagues, architects and urban planners. So our profession is appropriated. It is also taught in the military doctrines in the Israeli military academia. They are studying Deleuze, Foucault, Lefebvre. They are all part of the military doctrines, so they can understand how cities function to reverse that function and use that knowledge for oppression and control. I leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you, Nuran. So from a very short first hint at our responsibilities to a very clear one, I think. And you talked about how architecture and building sort of oppresses. But in the beginning, you also mentioned sometimes vernacular architectural culture is being destroyed. And I want to, well, first we have another picture, but I want to come back to something you also said, Esha, about these immortals and how this kind of immortality also has to do with losing some identity. So that is something I would really like to pick your brain a bit out on how you see that happening. But first, I want to give the floor to Andre.
Thank you very much. I just want to second what Nuran said about this pharmacological dimension of architecture. It can be a poison and a remedy. It can be both. It depends. What does this have to do with architecture? You will see soon. We go to the so-called deep history. I want to show you what I consider to be perhaps the most convincing cut in the history of film, which gives us within few, I think 5 seconds, transition that takes place in the course of 4 million years, exactly. And this is the point where the first tool, as it were, emerges. So I want to make a point that up to this moment, we were relying on the Darwinian evolution. Things were unfolding in a particular way so as to adapt to the already given situation. But the moment we have devised and invented tools, we stepped out of the evolution and did something that is could be associated with this move of the Baron Munchausen bootstrapping moment, where you pull yourself by your own hair. So up to this. So this is the point of bifurcation between Darwin and Lamarck. Lamarck famously said that we are not only dependent on what is already there to be occupied as a niche, we can actually construct a niche, we can make a difference. So there is a bifurcation there, and there is a difference in kind in the unfolding of these two transitions. By contrast, the distinction between the bone as the tool and the spaceship there's no different in kind there, there's only a difference in degree of differences. So I want to say that at this point, you could say that what we have done, we stopped relying on our internal organs, and it has been said by people like Bernard Stiegler, we have taken our organs out of the body. So this could also be described as a process of exosomatization or exo-organization, exorganism, like the tool itself. And of course, this inevitably calls forth our ingrained ideas about mnemotechnology. So as of this moment, we are not to be under the spell of one particular way of transmission of memory, namely the genetic, passing on genes from the parents to the offspring, and so on. We have devised ways of passing on information otherwise. That is to say, there is epigenetic way of doing it. We have invented language, narratives, you said already by yourself, a very powerful technology, but still very much relies on the nervous system. But I want to emphasize something that I think architecture plays a very big role in, and that this is the third kind of memory. So neither the genetic, nor the epigenetic, but epiphylogenetic, the memory that is sedimented, that is transgenerational, like we were talking about the squares, the cities, something you are born into and something that is going to remain there long after you're gone. So I think it's something that it provides for perhaps something that should not be underestimated in its power to create collectives. And I say this because, and I'm going to finish on this, any thinking does not occur voluntarily. It has to be provoked. You have to be provoked into thinking, and I think it is the encounter with something that cannot be subsumed under already fully constituted categories that actually forces you to think. And exo-organization, this moment, which is captured in Kubrick's movie from 1968, is that moment of exosomatization, exo-organization that then confronts us with a new condition that cannot be subsumed by anything that we have already put in very neat categories, a priori pigeonholes, but it actually forces you to think, what is happening now? And I want to think that public space, real, true public space, is marked by this non-indeterminacy of sorts, that we don't know as yet what might happen. Something that I think you were also describing in this idea of that we are not transmitting something as in passing on information from A to B. The stimulus and response is let's say, there's an interval between the two that is inserted, which provides for the possibility of something unexpected to occur. And I think that's my definition of thinking. The inserting of the interval between the cause and effect, between the stimulus and the response. And I'll bring it closer to architecture if I have a chance next time, in the next round, if I may. So not to take too much of your time. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that, but I do want to just ask you a bit more when you talk about this interval, and before you also already, and it was mentioned before, about the virtual. And as I said, I agree, I think the virtual doesn't offer what real space offers, because you can create different spaces, different public virtual spaces where you indeed sort of you bifurcate truths and make the echo chambers that we're all aware of. So I just wanted to quickly hear what you think about that, and sort of going from A to B and having time to think. Do we still go from A to B with time to think in these virtual echo chambers?
In his corridor.
Yeah.
Before I answer, let me just briefly, because I didn't touch on the idea of technicity, I think I should define it. Technicity is exactly what my colleague has referred to when you mentioned Churchill's idea that we build the cities and in turn they build us. So the tool is that thing that the what that determines the who, and the other way around. There's a kind of reciprocity of determination between the two. But then to answer your question directly, the virtual is that which is in excess of the actual, but that does not make it any less real. It is the Borges's existence of multiple paths that don't necessarily you don't need to take the path, but it's already determining what is precluded and what is more likely to happen. It's the virtual is the incorporeal yet fully real. It's abstract yet not ideal. It's actually the potential that every and any space bears and does not need to be exhausted. And I think this is why in my teaching I very often refer to this beautiful concept by the psychologist by the name of Gibson, who talks about affordances. There is a movement that tries to approach architecture not as an object, but as a relation, as something that is from the experiential point of view. So the affordance is something that is fully relational, so full of potential, but how it's going to play out depends on a myriad of variables, so you can't tell in advance. Anything, not to be, I should perhaps stop now, but I hope I have answered your question. So the virtual is fully real, albeit incorporeal.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
So I would actually, following on this thing of the virtual, first, Ivo, I would like to hear what your opinion is on that, because you already sort of mentioned it briefly in your talk.
Yeah. The point I was trying to make is indeed that I think the environment we live in becomes much more virtual and digital, and we have the smart. I don't think necessarily that a digital or virtual environment is less conducive to truth or to democracy, but it becomes even, or maybe even more important to think about how we design these environments. So we know this phenomenon of echo chambers, but I mean, the virtual environment can also have distinct advantages. Well, for example, like I said, I think one important thing also in finding truth is that we feel safe, but it can also, being anonymous can be misused, but can also be an advantage, also playing with our identity or finding out truth. So I think the digital environment or the virtual environment also has advantages that we can use. So I'm not necessarily used about the virtual or the digital environment, but I think they require us even more than the built environment to think about what are the design parameters, so to say, or whatever you call it, but how should we design these environments in order for them to be. And what I found worrisome is that these environments are mainly owned by commercial parties. I think there is really a political problem. While, I mean, the built environment, we still very much in the public sphere, but these are largely shaped by private companies. And I think this is a really political problem, because even if we have an idea about what we found important values or features, yeah, it might depend on the commercial partners whether they really put into this digital environment. So I would say one of the things politically that is needed is to recognize that we make these environments also, that these are public spaces in a sense. Just like the built environment, the digital environment is also a public space, and we need to shape it as a public space, I would say.
Exactly.
Important. I don't mean by virtual, I don't mean digital.
No.
Okay.
Okay, well, the design is important in this virtual, but the design is definitely also important in the physical environment. And let's come back to that also together in the discussions with the audience. But I also want to, because this aspect of this the commercial and the private sort of shaping increasingly our spaces. For me, it also made me think again of the points that Nuran and Esha, you were making about you have the vernacular, the identity, cultural, this can be destroyed, and that sort of links to this idea of these immortals, where you have this loss of identity. Okay, you're immortal, but what does it actually mean? And then I wonder what we are now doing with our world, with our built environment. It's making it very sort of without identity, without a possibility of people to appropriate it and come together in all their differences. It's becoming this sort of globalized nothing kind of thing. So I wonder how you would look at that.
Should I go first? I think it's so thankful. I mean, well, how to put it? But thank you for bringing these images, which are so horrendous, and bringing them here in the middle of our discussion, because it is very important to engage with them. I think one of the first thought came in my mind, actually, when I looked at these images and when I heard you speaking, that behind actually every act of massive destruction, there is also a question of identity that wants actually permanence over a longer period of time. Now, if one takes the Israeli-Palestine conflict, or one takes actually, you know, because it goes back to what happened during the Nazi Germany, and during the Nazi Germany, Hitler had an idea to create what he called, turn Berlin into Germania, and he talked about creating a culture for 1,000 years. And what has World War II brought to us actually at one point, that we got an atom bomb that the World War II brought us to. Now the history behind the atom bomb is also how that the 1,000 suns actually bright up. Now so the point here is that in every act of destruction, when we think about it's a matter of justice, and it's also a matter of inclusion. It's also a matter of how certain community or certain people of culture are being destroyed. Here, particularly when you mention this destruction happens by destroying the built environment, because the built environment is also created over a very long period of time. This is also something that preserves our culture over a long period of time. It is something so visually available to see, actually. This is something part of all our growing up, the multi-generational raising, actually. So it's a part of our memory. And in destroying that built environment and the cities, that an entire culture is actually being erased. But on behind that, there is another culture wants to have the space and dominance, but also that dominance wants to have a permanence in their existence, the immortality of that culture. And that part of the side of the story we often don't engage with. So we look at what is being destroyed, but we don't look at the psychological motivations, the existential motivations actually that drive that massive point of destruction, because that also we need to understand in order to stop that form of destruction that happens. So I'm not sure whether I'm kind of engaging with Caroline, your question.
Yes,
but,
yeah, very much.
But actually, this is where it's a very nice point that you bring, because, yeah, the monocultural, the dominance, but this is also a process of othering. You know, he is the other. He is dehumanized, demonized, and his built environment, his habitat, is also something you need to uproot. So this was also systematically, you know, portrayed in the media before the invasion of Iraq, in every Israeli invasion to the Palestinian cities, the terrorist nest, you know. So this is also a process, when you say the immortal, it is also like the other doesn't have the right to live. So it's all this like Agamben theory about the state of exception, the absence of law. These are present in these extreme, of course, conditions. But when you mention, like Caroline, yeah, this is a war crime for me. And actually what we were discussing, like genocide is an act against humanity. And of course, there are all these legal aspects that grew after the Second World War. And I am calling also that the human production of built environment, which is the glory of our civilization for centuries, also destroying them is also a crime against humanity. Not only the cultural artifact, everything we produce as human beings is also a process of knowledge development, technology development and advancement. Part of our identity and history is also embedded in this built environment. So this is what I'm calling urbicide, the intentional destruction of urbanity. And this is something that we need also to address as such, because in all these conditions, who writes the narrative? The most important, the powerful. The invasion of Fallujah, the destruction of Dresden, you know, the carpet bombing of all these German cities on the pretext that, yeah, of course, that we need to end the war. But nobody is talking about what has happened there. It's a taboo. And for me, it is very important that we as an architects and urbanists, professional in this domain, also the academics, we need also to take our responsibilities, the moral and ethical responsibilities. We cannot stay silent or complicit. Being in a war zone, a colonial context, but also here in the Netherlands, we need to be part of this emancipation process. As you mentioned, in this new liberal society that we are living, the mass production, polarization of our communities between this extreme differentiation between the poor and the rich, and the absence that also is presented and reflected in our public space. You see that the diversity we are looking at and we want to create, to celebrate our humanity, is little by little is also disappearing in our cities.
Thank you. Yeah, I know. Sorry, Roberto or Filippo? Okay.
Now, since you, thank you very much for this. No, you don't have to be sorry. I said that being emotional is the first way to communicate also about these things. And yeah, it is an emotional talk. And I was very triggered by your reference to responsibility that we have. And in my research on ethics of technology, I've studied a lot of concept of responsibility. And also in what I said before, I think that what you said about distraction and democracy was speaking to this idea that, what I said before, about the importance of the body as a way as an obstacle where you cannot ignore that someone else is there, and it's a call for explanation. Why you're here? Why is this thing there? And that's the beginning of a conversation about what's the story of this, what's behind that, what are the reasons for this to be built in this way, if it is a physical object, or for you to be here today and talking and bringing this story as opposed to another story is a call for recognizing that there are always reasons and histories behind what you're saying. And you cannot ignore that, right? So I found very interesting, I haven't thought about that, a very interesting connection between this idea of responsibility for what you're saying, and for what you teach, and for what you bring, and recognizing where you come from, to the importance of historicity of buildings also as a way to force us to reflect where does this come from and why it's there, and distraction as the negation of that.
But this is actually a very interesting discussion. I'm just interfering, Caroline, because is this also I think academia is the very platform for these discussions, because this is our responsibility. We are the ones who are looked at to produce this knowledge, to show people alternatives, how to rethink about certain struggles and challenges. And of course, educate the generation of the future who are going to be an architect in a municipality, in a ministry. So it's not always about war zones. Also, these people have this responsibility to be the voice of the voiceless. If you look at the extreme poverty, I don't know, like the slums in India, look at all these extreme conditions we live in. They are not present in the public arena. They are not here. They are not even visible. So this is our responsibility, ethical responsibility towards them.
I just wanted to highlight in the story that Nuram brings us, this importance of the collective endeavor that is the city, right? I don't think the city is the product of yours or mine actions. It's a collective endeavor. And I think when you're talking about it, what I hear is we as a people, as Palestinians, we are attached to that collective endeavor. And people who want to erase us, they want to erase that we created together, right? And in that sense, I want to go back to what you said about, it really intrigues me, and I think you are right. Sometimes action leads to truth, and I agree with that. But at the same time, I'm a bit concerned that if we put the architect and the designer as the only responsible for action, then we are in the wrong path. We need to, I think, sorry, we need to do nothing, but I think I'm very prescriptive. I prefer to think of design as a collective endeavor in which we are all doing something together. But in order to do that something together, we need to agree. And by the way, we can convince other people by telling lies. Truth doesn't have anything to do with it. We can lie, but truth will lead to a more sustainable action, I think.
Can I jump in? I just want to mention, curiously, and I apologize in advance for my vocabulary, apart from lie and truth, there is also bullshitting. And there's been a very influential book by Professor Harry Frankfurt on bullshit. He says, liar always has to keep truth in check in order to lie, but the bullshitter does whatever it takes him. You know, it's goal-oriented, and sometimes they even may tell truths. What I wanted to challenge, I mean, because we shouldn't be agreeing all the time, as Javier points out. I'm also thinking architecture is this action at distance, in a very profound sense. Nelson Goodman distinguishes between allographic and autographic arts, like a sculptor would work on a piece of clay immediately, I mean, engaging with it in order to produce something. Architecture, not so much, because we never build anything. We produce drawings and write words, for, like notations for music, and eventually it gets built and so on. So I wanted to just say that it seems to me that, back to the idea of the inserting the interval, there are people who distinguish between instinct and institutions, and this is related to democracy in my understanding. Instinct is about immediate gratification. You know, it's a knee-jerk kind of thing. You try to hit me, and I try to protect myself. But when it comes to institutions, it's something that counts on a deferred gratification, satisfaction that comes really, really late. For example, instinctively, you would probably try to find a safe space to sleep, but you could also consider building a building. So that solves your problem in the long run. So there are people who actually claim that autocracies are measured by the number of laws that they pass on, because laws are restrictive. They tell you what is not allowed, what is prohibited. But democracies are, the quality of democracy is measured by the number of institutions that they have, because institutions are affirmative and not restrictive. And this is why, perhaps instead of thinking about institution in terms of like objects, in terms of, from the point of view of ontology of process, if we think about instituting an architecture, to what an extent it plays the role in instituting something, then you realize that perhaps we should reconsider this idea of that there's something, I mean, we need to think in terms of like long durations, in Bergsonian terms, very much, you know, like, as I said, profound action at distance, and thinking beyond perhaps our biological finitude. And that, you know, is something really, dare I say, not takes us in a post-human direction, even more than human. You have to be able to rid yourself of yourself in order to think in terms of that goes beyond your immediate interest. And one last thing, if I may say, just because this answers your initial idea, you know, it's very obvious that we don't always do things that eventually, you know, how is it that we do things that go against our best interest very often? So I think it seems to me that it would be somewhat naive to think that we can come together and think of a better future. It's been tried before, and these futures turn out to be dystopian. I think in order to understand what is actually going on, we have to be daring enough to descend below the threshold of consciousness, so to abandon the idea of volition, of intentionality, and think, how is it that the desire works? And the marketing people, they know how to do it, and we somehow shy away from engaging that level, which, you know consciously that it's bad for you to smoke, and yet you go out and light another cigarette. And, you know, that's something that I find really challenging, and I'd like to, you know.
Comment on your, because I think you are right, it's not only our own responsibility, especially now we are talking about all these challenges like the transitions, energy, circularity, climate. I work in South Limburg, and this is what I am working on, interdisciplinary action, and like the social worker, the health professional, and so forth. I don't believe in the God architect anymore. This was the 60s. I am more with the social architecture. But at the same time, our power lies that we are the one drawing these lines. This is really where it is becoming dangerous.
But Nora, can I apologize, I'll stop after that. You know, talking about responsibility, it's highly moralistic, and it puts this burden of, you know, like it's about duty, as it were. But I like to go, to counterpose it with an idea that comes from Haraway, who talks about response hyphen ability, the ability to respond, because not everybody has the same capacity. It goes back to the body and,
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point, and I want to, before I open the questions, I want to bring it back to this idea of democratic and democratic space, where I think we all, as a member of a democratic society, have this kind of responsibility, whether it's responsibility or the responsibility, and as a member, and if we're an architect, then we have certain skills. If we're a philosopher, we have certain skills. If we're an educator, we have certain skills. So we cannot detach I think the person, or the sort of the person in the democracy from what they do in the society. So I do think that there's also always some responsibility in whatever form attached to you as an individual, and the profession or the path that you choose. So maybe with that thought, I want to open the floor for questions from the audience to our panel, or some reflections. Yes. Or you can come to... Yes. Maybe quickly just state your name. It's always nice to know who's talking.
My name is Andrea. Okay, so I had a question about the public space, because you very often refer to the Greek agora as a nostalgic public space, that it was inclusive and people were expressing themselves, but I question it, was it really inclusive? Because there were more educated people there who had really access there. It was not really the public. And so I'm also questioning myself, was there ever a really inclusive public space? Because when I go, right now, I am from Cyprus, so there is this new public square from Zaha Hadid, which is really controlled by security and cameras, which is not really a public space that I will use. But when I go back and think about the public space that used to be there, but really 40 years ago, when I talked to my grandmother, she was talking that in order for women to be able to use the public space, they had to be with a man with them. So I'm not sure if it was there a really not a well-known public inclusive space, either on the past or now, because of different reasons. No.
I mean, I think historically completely right. I mean, the agora is often used as the symbol of the public space, but of course it's where the males, non-slaves, for who it was the public space. So I think you're completely right that in that sense it was not a public space. And maybe that idea, I mean, one way of thinking about it is that it is more an ideal than something you can completely realize. But the ideal might still be useful. But I think it is also interesting. So I don't know so much about the agora as an architecture. I think it is, for me, an interesting question is, why was it not more inclusive? Is that because of social or institutional factors? Or had it also to do with the architecture? I'm not an architect. I cannot really answer that question, but I found that a kind of interesting question.
But who defines inclusion? And this is where I am finding it interesting, because social inclusion is also actually evolving through generations and civilizations and time and space. During 50 years ago or 100 years ago, that in these vernacular cities also that was limited presence of certain people with a certain women presence, but there was the possibility and the opportunity to be there. And this is also a sort of inclusion. So in our times, inclusion is totally differently defined. It is about everyone is entitled to the public space, with this, which is more the ideal.
I think a lot of people, sorry to interrupt, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I think a lot of people use the agora as the ideal agora and not the real one.
Yeah.
Because the real one we know was not inclusive at all, right? But I think the idea is what is attractive to people. Yeah.
Different scales to that.
And I think you're totally right that inclusion has evolved in the time of your grandmother. She couldn't go out without a man, right? And now people can in Cyprus, not in everywhere in the world. So that's important to keep in mind.
Yeah, but I also think the point of the body here, and sort of linking to what Nuran said, it's having, do you dare to be there in that space and claim certain things? Again, it makes me think of this action in South Africa where people just claim the motorway, then at that point to make their point. So, or the student protest on the Tiananmen Square, which was supposedly also public space, but not really. But you put your body there. I think that's an important aspect. Andre?
I just wanted to mention that public space, as I tried to explain earlier, to my mind, has to do with this idea of indeterminacy. So it does not preclude, nor does it prescribe who is going to be there. It's not about bringing all things together under the concept of diversity. No, it's about engendering something that has not as yet existed. The idea is that possibly with any good, excellent piece of art, you are rewiring brains. Your audience does not yet exist. People don't exist. You fashion, you engender people by exposing them to something that they have yet to kind of subsume, understand what's going on. So it's about it's about creating your own audience. And I think we have to exit, I mean, we have to somehow ditch this idea of container kind of conception of space that then is filled by events or people or what you name it. And I think in that sense, I want to maybe also stretch this to include the idea that the digital space cannot be disregarded. Foucault has this idea that we have exited what he calls the disciplinary space of enclosure, that actually, you know, in the school, we move out, there is a pub, and so on. And they say that today we actually could be, this could be described as the space of control, in the sense that now it's not about enclosure, it's about thresholds, it's about passwords. You know, you lose your wallet and suddenly you have no identity, and there's no way of you to enter the railway station in Delft anymore. So, you know, it's about managing how far can you get, and that gives you a completely different sense of space. And I just want to mention in terms of like the point of view, even that has been challenged. Picon, the French architecture historian at Harvard, he says, perhaps with, you know, people who rely on navigation of their, you know, the smart city thing that optimizes traffic, for example, they don't need a body anymore even. I mean, it could be, they don't, like the city could go back to the paradigm of the Gothic city, which is completely illegible. It does not rely on long vistas, foreshortening perspective and stuff like that, because every time you can just simply look where you are and find your ways by relying on the navigation system. So that messes up the whole thing, you know.
Do you experience an inclusive public space nowadays?
I'm not sure.
Because actually for me, it is not being inclusive all time in all moments, but actually the possibility of occupying that public space when there is a need, and we saw it in this movement, Podemos, Occupy, everyone was entitled and was in that public space. And this is actually the ultimate inclusion moment that we can imagine, but not in all moments. So this is more idealistic way of explaining it. Did we answer your question? Sort of.
Thank you.
Thank you. Julia.
Hello, my name is Julia, and while I wasn't born into an oppressive system, I kind of grew up with the memory of it. Well, maybe it was oppressive to some, and to some it was very luxurious, but it was the communist times in Poland. And while I was born already after the change of the system, well, the memory of my parents and grandparents kind of maybe somehow informed the line of inquiry which I'm interested in now, which as Roberto and Caroline, known as the public participation. And I feel like this has been kind of a topic which was maybe not quite touched upon directly, but indirectly it was very, to me at least, it was very much present. Once one of the panelists, I didn't note who said that, but can architecture contribute before we agree? So the pre-consensus idea of the public space, and then I think it was Filippo who said that we need rhetoric when we don't have a common space. And I was thinking, well, do we need participation when we don't have a common space? So my question is it's an open question, so please feel free to respond if you have any ideas about it. But to what extent and how can participation be meaningful in a privatized space? And if there is no truly inclusive public space left, who is there to be the agent of the powerless, and how can you hack this type of economy or arrangement that we're in, where participation is doesn't seem to be meaningful anymore? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Who wants to try and answer?
Maybe I can answer from experience. Now I am working in an urban living lab in South Limburg in a city called Heerlen, and it is a post-mining area where it's now like all these extreme social problems, as the politicians want to frame it. Oh, this is televised. I'm going to be critical now. But in these neighborhoods, you also notice like the diversity of the local community, like people from migrants background, all these waves of refugees who came here, with also the people who are there for so many years. So the diversity of the local community is also sort of challenging for us as urban designers. So now with our students in this participatory process that we are claiming, co-creation and so forth, it is so difficult to find a way to bring a common agenda across all these diverse groups. So what we are trying to do is to bring as much as possible of the ambitions and the agendas of these participants as possible. But of course, we cannot address everyone and everything. So this is at least how I see it now. Participatory processes are important, but also have their limitations. Because also democracy is the dictatorship of the majority. There is always a minority who doesn't agree.
Can I say something? Oh, sorry. Super quickly. I don't think we need to look for consensus exactly. I think democracy is basically a lot of conflict. It's not consensus, although people romanticize consensus a lot and they want consensus. But I think we need to listen to different claims and then try to decide what to do with them, right?
I think I sort of want to say one thing, that how the public-private distinction is increasingly being erased in our culture these days. That how some of the very prominent movements in our time, such as the women's movement or the gay movement, actually have brought the bedrooms out in the public. And talking about the public issues there are about taking the issues back in the bedroom. So I just want to leave that thought with you, that this distinction needs to be also rethought about. I mean, if one attends the Pride Parade anywhere in the world, actually, that mostly this is about displaying the gay body as a human body, as a normal body. And particularly in Amsterdam, actually, how these pride parades are about actually bringing your nudity out into, in order to claim your humanity. So I just want to leave that thought about your question, leave you with that thought about your question.
Can I quickly? Oh no, Ibo was first. Go Ibo, sorry.
My remark was actually quite similar, and it relates maybe also a bit to the previous. So I think, interestingly, we can also claim something as a public space, or make it a public space, I think. And then, so I think, take the example of the Tiananmen Square. I think it was never intended, of course, that people started to protest there to claim it, but people did it. And I think this is also something we can do with private spaces, or we can occupy these spaces and try to make them public. So there's also a possibility of, say, activism to claim a space that is not public or not fully public to make it public. So I think there is also always a kind of interesting possibility. I mean, I think the environment partly shapes us, but we can also resist that shaping. And I think that's also important to be aware of. And I think that was also a bit in the previous remark.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say, again, that I know we're talking space and we are interested in architecture, but I think indeed that we should not overestimate the visual aspect of the space, so the physical aspect of the space. So what really, if you say public participation, to me the key is participation. So what are the norms that regulate a certain space? What are the relationships that we can have in a certain space? So a family, a house that can be, ideally the space for warmth and love can be the worst place of oppression and non-participation, whereas a public square that we can idealize as, open and inclusive can indeed be the place of oppression or killing or et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's always important, and digital and virtual spaces have taught us that more than the physicality of the space is the kind of norms or reasons or rules that eventually determine whether a space is really inclusive and allows for participation or doesn't, right?
But there is a danger of also like standardization and generalization, because what is a public space in Europe is not a public space or a private space in the Middle East or in Africa or in Latin America.
Yeah,
so this is
right.
where also we need to respect these cultural differences. Context matters at the end.
Yeah, and coming, sorry, to this point, I mean, we tend to think of democracy in the sense of the Western liberal democracy, but
the only reference.
Right, but there are and we think, for instance, typically of China as the place of oppression and dictatorship, and then you have spaces, for instance, a colleague of ours showed me stories of public deliberation in Chinese cities that are very interesting in terms of direct participation. So again, looking at the local spaces and the rules that really govern the relationships is sometimes more important than the general rules or space.
Can I just add to what you said, Filippo? These rules and norms, they do emerge out of a certain situation. They don't come from elsewhere. So it seems to me that what needs to be highlighted is this idea of plasticity, where the condition is not bigger than that which is conditioned, which is to say you don't have a set of a priori ideas of what a public space might mean, but these norms and rules coagulate, coalesce into something that at that occasion becomes, public. So perhaps instead of thinking about the public space, we should think the same way as I think it's very cleverly done in the title of this talk. It says the forming of truth, like the forming of publicness, rather than a space. Space comes last, not first.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. We have another question.
Hi, everyone. I'm Beatrice. And first of all, thank you for all your very inspiring stories that you brought us. My question is actually a bit in line with what is already questioned, but since we're here at the architecture faculty and we're always architecture students who want to try to design also inclusive environments, I was wondering, do you have any idea about how all these ideals can be translated into physical designs of the urban public space where inclusiveness and diversity is welcoming, sort of?
Roberto?
I'm so repetitive. I always say the same thing, and I apologize. But for me, the key really is co-design. And it's not going to come from your head only. It's going to come from several heads, right? I don't know what space is this. I don't think we have true public space in our cities, even now. So we are looking for it. It's like the Agora, huh? We are looking for the Agora. It's not there, but how can we find it?
Is it a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow?
I hope not, because we will never find that.
Exactly, I hope so too.
But also it depends on context, Now we also have all these challenges, climate adaptive solutions, circular. Oh my God, all these tools we also need to consider as designers in a public space to comply with all these SDGs goals and so forth. So like nature-based, and these are all tools. But the most important is defining your challenge. What is your problematic or the question that you want to address in your design? In some areas, it's really social. Others is more economic. Maybe others are more environmental. So this is where actually we as designers are adapting our tools according to the context needs, not only from the physical, spatial, but the social, the cultural, are very important also components. So this is what we are also good in doing, in negotiating all these opinions and translating them into possibilities, designs, opportunities, and then experimenting with some interventions.
Can I just jump in, because I think I have to. There is a famous line by a filmmaker, Godard, who says, don't try to make a just movie, just make a movie. In other words, you try it out and see, it's the most important thing from my point of view is to escape the cliche, the stereotype, doing something over and over again. For an already constituted, fully given audience that you have in your mind, you have to create your audience. And how to do it, I have no idea. And I shy away from any prescriptive advice, ever.
Is that an answer?
Yes, thank you very much. It's a bit broad, but thank you very much.
Zara.
I'm taller than them, so I'm gonna get a bit higher. So hi, first of all, thank you all. Well, Isha, you mentioned two words, that is culture and immortality. And now I have more of a statement than a question for you all. Because I'm from Palestine, from the Israeli part, al-Fahim. My name is Zahra, by the way. And you spoke about how it is in Nablus, for example. But in Israel itself, there is this kind of separation of how the cities will develop, because there are no more, since the occupation, there have been no new Arab cities, but hundreds of new Jewish ones and Jewish settlers. So I remember I studied in Technion, architecture also, and I remember being asked the question at the first week about public space. And they asked us, what is a public space? So I asked, okay, it's just space. And then they said, okay, public space, I heard this kind of answer that where people all meet and everything. So they meet, they talk, they can be whatever they want. And I remember thinking, so it's my grandma's living room, basically. So that's my public space in my city, because in my city, as an Arab city that develops, there are no public spaces because they just want to build. They don't really have this new way of building public space. So I remember saying that's my grandma's house and the shared space with my uncle's house. Caroline is my mentor, so she knows what I'm talking about. And I remember, right now, Isha, when you were talking, you made me think about how, first of all, there's no culture, because you mentioned there's no culture like animals, but even animals have culture. Their own culture, because culture is based of rules that sometimes are spoken, sometimes are not. So there is a culture even for animals. And now I think you made me think that immortality is not about the people, but the immortality is about the space and our identity as Palestinians. So the identity that is gonna keep going for generations, that's the immortal part. And that's what makes space. So also space, in Arabic we say the land is going to remember and remember us all. So the immortality is about space, and it's about space, and it's about, it's about the culture itself. That's why I actually joined this talk, because I'm really into philosophy. I really like these things. So, but I can see how you were talking about immortality, but this is how I see immortality. So, do you see that there is possibility that there is no culture and therefore maybe no immortality?
You're absolutely spot on, actually, because that's what exactly I meant by that how the culture is preserved, actually, in the built environment. The culture is a memory. culture is also created over a very, very long period of time. The period of time which is beyond any one generation of human beings possible to create that culture. All culture, you take science, you take art, you take build cities actually, because again, you are the students of architecture here, that all that culture is constructed over hundreds and hundreds of years, which no human being can survive. So there is this component about immortality in creating the culture of permanence, endurance that can survive beyond our time on this earth. So that is one side of it. But the other side, because you bring this conflict between Israel and Palestine, that how Israelis are destroying that culture actually by destroying the built environment. And that is where the entire race is being erased here. So it's also not just about this conflict about the space, because it is not only about occupation. It is actually about erasing the entire long-standing culture which is built very painstakingly over a very long period of time. So the point here I also want to make is probably that is little controversial, that what is this conflict actually is very clear on the matter of justice, right? Because there is this right to exist is being eradicated by the Israelis. But why is that instinct that comes from the Israeli side? Why is it that those people who are dominating, those who are perpetrating these crimes actually, you know, the war crime, why are they doing? Are they necessarily bad people and hence they are doing actually? I mean, that is a question I'm trying to ask
But
you.
you cannot justify what is done by just questioning the intentions.
No, but I have the answer for you, which is power.
Exactly.
They have their backs, they have their power, they have the politics,
but where
they have
is
the money.
the need for the power come from? What is that the power desire? Power desires only the control over the other people, the othering, the question of the othering. My point is that it is more than that. It is about actually, and that needs to be understood in order to then make sure that humanity never does that kind of war crimes, that we never end up with that kind of, genocidal situation all over the that is the point I'm trying to make.
This is very utopian. This is part of our human nature, power. But can I answer a bit of what she's saying? Because actually for Palestinians, and this is where I find it interesting, we have Palestinians residing in what was once Palestine in 1948. That is now Israel, now the occupied territories and the refugee camps in the Arab world and in diaspora like me. And what is then Palestine becomes an idea, you know? It is all these Palestinian spaces that are sort of telling and preserving the Palestinian narrative. And all the symbolism is around it. It is immortal for me. Because now it is going cross generations, people who live in a refugee camp in Syria. It is part of the story. They will not maybe come back to Palestine one day, but they are claiming that right.
So I want to take 30 seconds to just say one thing. You said the quest for power is a human nature. Now, I question that. I would say that the human beings are actually hardwired for empathy.
Exactly,
and if
that's what I wanted
for
to
empathy,
relate to his...
why is that the one particular culture actually spends, and both the sides also sees massive destruction. It's the destruction is often more on the side of the occupied territory, of course, but still the destruction is both sides, actually. So, I mean, I want to question whether quest for power is a human nature or not. I say it's the other way around.
Okay, thank you all very much. I think it beautifully illustrates the importance of discussing these things and not, like you said, Roberto, aim for consensus. We are not going anywhere with consensus. We need dialogue. And so thank you all very, very much for this amazing discussion and dialogue. Thank you for being here. Thank you to the audience. And I think, Javier, you want to close the session.
Thank you very, very much, panelists. It was really passionate. I think we could have gone on, I still have half an hour or longer. It's started to get really warm, so thank you very much for the discussion. I just want to make the last announcement of this year because the BK Talks, as I mentioned earlier, will be back in September. But next week we have one exhibition, last exhibition of this year, which is If Buildings Were Landscapes. It's the work of, it shows part of the work of a former PhD graduate here at the Faculty of Architecture, Daniel Jousselin. So he and his team, and together with us, have put together an amazing exhibition, which is coming from Paris right now, about, it says in the title, buildings and landscapes. I would also actually say that it's about the right to buildings, because we have been talking about the right to public space, not so much about the right of maybe housing, and also the right to nature, no? And the right to housing, and the right to landscape. So with that said, please join us next Friday at 4 for the opening. There's gonna be drinks, so free drinks for everybody who wants to join us. Thank you very much, and see you very soon in September. Bye.